Today I'm pleased to welcome to the studio Francis McLeod. Francis is a founding partner of the Forensic Risk Alliance. With a master's degree from Oxford, Francis has a robust and extensive experience in investment banking, forensic investigations, and monitorships. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to meet Francis at an event hosted by George Washington University, where we were co-panelists. So it's a pleasure to see you here again.
Thank you very much, Richard.
So, Francis, that was a very abbreviated part of your background. So perhaps you can share a little bit more about your career trajectory through investment banking and being a founding member of the Forensic Risk Alliance.
Yes, with pleasure. So I started my career as a mergers and acquisitions investment banker based in London and then latterly in China, Hong Kong and in Indonesia. And that was really my first exposure to, particularly in Indonesia, large-scale corruption in the mid-90s. And I saw firsthand really how corruption retards economic development. Fast forward a couple of years and I was headhunted because of my banking background and also my French and German language experience to become involved in the Swiss bank investigations into Holocaust-era assets. So I spent a few years in the late 90s in Switzerland tracking down what was referred to as Nazi gold, but really dormant bank accounts. And while I was there, met one of my co-founders, who's very much a data analytics sort of database architecture guru, and a third partner who was in London at the time with an investment banking background. And we decided to set up FRA in order to offer those type of complex investigative services to corporates at that time predominantly in Europe. But lo and behold, not even a few years in, almost immediately, we found that the bulk of enforcement in a variety of areas, including anti-corruption, was being driven by US enforcement initiatives. So we found ourselves doing a lot of cross-border work for European companies responding to US regulatory investigations. And we're now a team of over 130 professionals, split between Europe and the US. And we are very busy, as you say, on anti-bribery and corruption investigations, compliance reviews and testing, advisory work in that space. And more recently, we've had the pleasure of being involved in a number of FCPA-related monitorships post-settlement.
So let's take a look at our FCPA and anti-bribery sort of global world today. We've got the Department of Justice. They just issued the evaluation of corporate compliance programs, plus their previous guidance. Now we have ISO 37001, plus other international anti-bribery regulations.
Right.
And these are not harmonized. And I know that's an issue that you've talked about. So for a multinational that's now looking at this layer upon layer of international guidance, international law, third-party platforms like ISO, where are we at? Like, where would a multinational start now?
Right. Well, I think it's interesting because I do think it's part of a trajectory that started, back when we set up in 99, and really a lot of our anti-bribery and corruption work really gained momentum in the mid-2000s around the oil for food program investigations and so
That's
on.
Right.
But I think we've just seen an ever more trend towards the globalization of enforcement, more and more cooperation between different enforcement agencies, and more risks associated with that too.
Sure.
And I don't think that's something we're going to see ending. I mean, to add to your comments about external providers of services such as the ISO, obviously US enforcement still very, very active. The SFO in the UK has really upped its game and is taking on larger and larger cases. But we even have France with Sapin 2 being introduced this year. You're right, it is very complicated. I think the simple answer to it is, as you always say when you do any kind of compliance testing in any area, and we do a lot of work in the banking compliance space as well, is you've got to persuade whoever you're dealing with to level up. You kind of have to take the highest standard and do your best to adhere to that standard. And I think it's incredibly dangerous, and we have seen this in a number of areas, to get overly focused on what the letter of the law says, rather than trying to create a compliance program that levels up, as I've said, and tries big picture to design something that is going to work across the board. And that has to mean to adhering to the highest standard.
And is this just a question of the supply side? In other words, are any of these regulations and enforcement issues, are they impacting the demand side of bribery, where in many of these cultures, traditions might appear to conflict with the rules, for lack of a better word?
It's interesting. So I do see improvements. I really do. So I think it still happens, but the really blatant, I'm an oil company and I want to get a concession in a particular country, so therefore I'm going to pay a large bribe to a government minister. I think the days of the mega corruption that I witnessed in Indonesia,
Right.
where the first family, when Suharto was in power, were taking 10 or 15% of every infrastructure
Everything.
project. I think that has waned. Does it still happen? Of course it still happens. I think that the pressures have kind of gone down the food chain a little bit more. And you and I have discussed this,
Right.
the pressures residing more at middle management level, or the people who are on site in country having to deal with the more petty corruption. A lot more around, licensing, the government touch points maybe at a lower level. But the thing I do see is and this is the optimist in me maybe, but I see increased awareness in the various jurisdictions where this really is a very real risk, and I see a lot of pressure around that. And I'll give you an anecdote. I was in China 2 years ago about this time, and we were doing a compliance audit as part of a monitorship engagement that we had that was in the FCPA space. And we were doing a shadow visit. So we were observing the compliance team and in fact, this company is a pretty sophisticated company, and they also had a forensic accounting team, but we were shadowing them doing a visit in China. And interesting results. We did some training around it. We observed what they were doing. We gave them some advice on how to calibrate what they were doing to make it a little bit more China specific. But while I was there, I had the opportunity to catch up with a number of friends who are still based out in Asia. And particularly the message that I was getting from my expatriate friends, and I have one in particular who does a lot of work around mentoring and corporate training of young executives in China.
Neat.
And he was saying the combination of the pressures on the young superstar executives, in their early 30s from foreign companies to hit their numbers, to grow the business,
Sure.
but also now to be compliant, was pulling them in two directions.
Right.
So on the one hand, they're saying, okay, Chinese growth is slowing, but we need more. We need better numbers. On the other hand, they're saying, and don't do anything that you're not allowed to do per our compliance program. Whereas years before, that message was kind of not as pronounced.
Right.
And it's putting people under huge amounts of pressure. So it really sensitized me, A, to the fact the message is getting through, but B, that it's creating additional pressures that maybe make people not be as cool, calm, and collected in the face of demands as they might be.
So it's a good thing that they're now at least experiencing these pressures, even if it results in some confusion as to what is success.
I think that's right.
Well, in this sort of global context, trying to be apolitical, but with change that's going on in the US administration, and now we see over in the UK with Brexit, I mean, have we evolved to the point that nothing's really going to change the tide of what's happening here?
I like to think so. I think it's very hard to turn back the clock on frankly, initiative that's been going really very actively for, a dozen plus years. And I think it's just less acceptable. I think, across the world, overt bribery and corruption is less acceptable. And again, anecdotally, we do a lot of work in Brazil. In some way, obviously, there's a huge anti-corruption initiative underway at the moment. In some ways, it's a blessing because people feel free now to talk more openly about the pressures that they're under, about the schemes that are out there, about what business as usual was like.
Sure.
And they feel liberated because they're seeing these initiatives in their own market. Look, our politicians are going to jail. This is all being exposed. Therefore, when you go in and ask questions, people are more open because they see that the tide is turning. Do I then now say, I'm so naive to say, do I think Brazil will be corruption free in the next X number of years? It's going to be a tough work in progress. As we were talking about culture change, takes a long time, years, if not decades. But I like to be optimistic that there's certainly no turning back. There's certainly no regression, I think, but the pace may ebb and flow a little bit, but I think the cat's out of the bag.
And that's really how we measure this.
Yeah.
It certainly isn't that precise.
No.
Right. So I was reading in the GIR a paper authored by an FRA partner called Another Fine Mess. where they talked about global settlements, which are still U.S. driven. So in today's environment where we see what's going on in the UK with the Serious Fraud Office, as you said, getting some momentum, new legislation in France, do you see that it's more of a multipolar environment now in terms of enforcement where it's not necessarily that the US has to be the investigative lead in these global issues?
I do, with the caveat, I think that when the matters seem to be very large, there's almost an inevitability, even if they're initiated outside of the US, that at some point the Department of Justice or the SEC are going to get involved. I think it adds a big wrinkle of complexity for companies, because I think the luxury of thinking you're only going to have to respond to a regulatory inquiry in one jurisdiction is sort of so much not what we're experiencing these days. And so there's a lot of strategic thought, I think, that needs to go into responses and consistency in responses. And then, as you pointed out, my colleague Rick Workman, who wrote the article about a fine mess, we do a lot of work with corporates and their counsel around fine calculation, so disgorgement and gain analysis. And when you're looking at that in a multi-jurisdictional context, there has to be a rigor and a consistency and a rationale behind what you're arguing. And obviously, we love doing the financial analysis around that. But what the company wants is finality in its settlement. It doesn't want a series of domino effect, settling here and then having to settle here and having to settle there. So I'm hopeful that there will be, there is good cooperation between a number of the enforcement agencies, but there will be some mechanism whereby corporates can get some level of comfort that at some point there will be a global settlement and there will be global fines levied, and how those are divvied up, I can't comment on at this point, but that there is a certain finality to that, because otherwise it makes, for everybody concerned, the timing around settlement so difficult to manage.
Sure. Well, going back to that harmonization, so even if the laws are not harmonized, do you see any sort of cooperation among prosecutors to at least let's harmonize the fining regimes?
That's a really good question, and I don't know that I know the answer to it. I mean, the US is so much more sophisticated and so much more experienced in this area, and have proven, frankly, that there is an economic rationale behind pursuing these anti-corruption investigations, because you can be dealing with very large penalties.
Like the calculation of loss, for example?
Exactly. So I think others are learning. I think others are looking. I mean, certainly Dutch authorities have been involved in a number of settlements. I suspect that there is reasonable amount of dialogue around how that works. Also, the Serious Fraud Office. So I'd like to think that's the case, because I think that will continue to give the emphasis to companies to try and settle. And try and get these issues resolved and bottomed out. And obviously, ironically, or not even ironically, but maybe logically, the stock markets tend to like it when companies settle, because you've drawn a line under it, you know what it cost. There is a sense that remediation is occurring. That this is a matter that's now resolved. So I'd like to think that we could get more joined up.
It's interesting. I recently heard David Green speak in Oslo. And he said, for us, DPAs really serve a policy aim. It lets a company move on.
Right.
Change their behavior, mitigate their conduct, sort of draw that line in the sand, and in a way that doesn't hurt innocent employees and customers. And I never really thought of that as being a policy aim, but it does make a lot of sense.
Yeah, it does. And I wholeheartedly agree with that as a position.
So going back to our global world of enforcement, tell me a little bit more about FRA. So for organizations that still might be struggling with this issue, or ones that are having a struggle, I know you're a global organization because I'm meeting your teams everywhere in the world where it seems that I'm speaking. So a little bit more about what you do.
Yes. Well, as you mentioned, we obviously are able to assist companies when they identify an issue. We're invariably engaged and work very closely with counsel. external counsel expert in navigating these white-collar issues. So we're very much involved in the investigations around the financial aspects of anti-bribery and corruption issues.
Internal investigations?
Internal investigations. We also do a fair bit of work in the remediation area. So when a company's identified an issue, we can come in and help them assess what went wrong in terms of their books and records, what went wrong in terms of failure around internal controls. We do a lot of training around that, and we do a lot of sort of advice on how to beef up controls. And because we love data, we're also quite strong on how to beef up system controls in accounting systems and so on. We also do have a team that are very expert around this whole disgorgement gain fine calculation. So in post-settlement or in settlement negotiations, we have a number of experts that are involved in that. And then, you know, if the company does end up being in that monitorship situation, I'm just started working my 7th monitorship. So we've got pretty deep experience there. And I think one of the benefits we bring, because we are transatlantic, is we have a very diverse team, both in terms of language skills, in terms of in-country experience, in terms of industry experience. We've made a very concerted effort to bring on board people that have experience from high-risk industries, aviation, aerospace and defence, oil services, oil and infrastructure. So we have a lot of experience in that space, which I think helps us understand the risks specific to a particular company and industry. And then we can also train them the corporates, once they've had an issue, to sort of stay on top of the testing around the efficacy of a compliance program. So there are a number of areas. The other thing I would add too is, again, because of having been involved in so many of these big global investigations, we were involved in all of the Alstom investigations all of the jurisdictions in which they had to respond to investigators. And so we're very familiar with the issues surrounding data transfer, things like the French blocking statute, data protection. So we're quite, I think, helpful in being able to help companies navigate that, and also, frankly, understand the whole US discovery environment, which is quite alien to a number of companies that have never had to go through it before.
I would imagine you see a lot of companies that have home offices in Europe and Asia, but still have a strong U.S. nexus, that it's probably a little bit of a struggle to understand what their responsibilities are over here.
Yes, I think that's right. And I think that increasingly this is part of, and we see it a lot, another area that we work in is pre and post mergers and acquisition due diligence, is this increasing that very risk associated with, you can't just dabble in these jurisdictions that are high risk and not have to address the potential real compliance risks associated with that, but also, do you really want to go into this market if you are going to expose yourself to risks around it? And so that's very much the case. I think there's virtually no such thing as a purely US or purely European or purely Asian conglomerate or South American conglomerate anymore. Really not. And so I think which is good. I mean, I think we enjoy the complexities of the world in which we live in, and clearly there are economic and commercial drivers behind globalization, but it means the globalization of compliance, which takes us full circle back to what you were talking about at the beginning. Yep.
And it seems like the companies now are really starting to think about, we need to understand what our risks are before we put boots on the ground and make those financial commitments. Do you see a little bit of a change to saying, let's look at it before and not look at it in the middle of a transaction or while we're engaging?
Absolutely. And I think that's why we see, I mean, when we started, the preventative or the proactive work was really in the minority. I say now, if we look at the split of the projects that we work on, it's probably 50-50. Which to me is a reflection on a heightened awareness of managing risks around doing business in regions that might expose you to anti-corruption risk.
Perfect. Well, thank you for your time, and I'll look forward to part 2 of our interview, where we'll talk about the confusing world of data transfer.
Thank you, Richard.